what is the right height. But in my experience, I've come across several situations with, the steepness of the hills to some of our lakes, because being in the Kettle area, with the grade changes, taller sidewalls would help because of the boathouses being built into the hillsides and stuff. So I'm not quite comfortable with the 10-foot cap on it at this point. I agree that 35-foot tall boathouses aren't ideal, but I'm not quite ready to limit them to 10 foot in height either. So I'm just bringing up now that I think it deserves some more thought. I don't have the solution yet, or my proposed change to it.
You can, yes. And I think that one of the comments here is that people often come into the office and with preliminarily, like, we're looking to build a boathouse, how tall can the wall be? And right now the staff's response without a policy discussion amongst the elected officials is 1 story. Well, right. So and then it, in theory, it puts them in a position to, well, what are you going to just allow me to do here? Right. And we haven't had this dialogue. So I think part of that is, if that's an area, that is certainly an area that we opted to put in as a clarification for ease of regulating this. And so that's the appropriate type of dialogue that I think you could be having today, you could be taking back and, thinking about.
Okay. I'm just putting it out there. It's something that I'm going to probably circle back to at some point.
Okay. Any other questions?
Actually, I understand all the changes here. The thing that strikes with me, maybe this was going to be covered at the end when you summarize, is legally non-conforming. So if you have anybody today that has anything that exceeds here, they have retaining wall, they have all that stuff, I'm assuming they're legally non-conforming, and we can't enforce them to remove their structure now that the code or statutes change.
That is my understanding. Brad, you want to comment on that?
Yeah, I think that's
Because that's what's going to impact constituents. They're going to say, what the hell, you're telling me I have to tear this down now? And no. So the answer is no, unless they make improvements to it. Then they got to comply with the change in statutes. That would be my biggest concern, just to make sure that that's clear to constituents.
Yeah, if you have something that's existing prior to the adoption of an amended ordinance, that can continue as long as you do not do anything to it.
yeah, absent any progressive changes or moves, I wouldn't think there'd be a circumstance that we would go try to retroactively enforce something like that.
That answers the question I had. Excuse me, what would be the effective date of these changes? And in fact, as you're just discussing now, current situations would be grandfathered in, so to speak.
Right. So as soon as the ordinance is passed and the county executive signs off on it, it's published, it'll become effective absent any other requirements in the law that I'm not aware of as I sit here right now, but it would be fairly immediate.
Just a quick rebuttal, Mr. Krebs. I don't know, a 10-foot wall seems sufficient because the roof structure, you could put in trusses that energy heals or whatever else, and you could get additional space if you got a tall mast and a boat or something. So, those restrictions wouldn't be there, but that's just my thinking regarding the 10-foot wall height.
Okay. All right, I guess we'll move on to the bottom of page 25. There's a highlighted section there regarding structure setbacks to wetlands. This is not being changed. However, we wanted to highlight this because this is a policy choice of the county. This was first put into the ordinance back in 2001. And so we're bringing this to the committee's attention because if the committee does not want this in here, it does not have to be in here. But, you want to say something?
Well, just to clarify on that, so we are recommending it it stay in. And are you gonna kick this one to Jake to comment on? Can we?
We'll get there. So anyway, it's a choice of the county to administer this particular section. Staff feels it's appropriate as a regulation and environmentally speaking. So we would like to know if the committee has concerns about keeping this section in right now. And I don't know, Jake, do you want to add any comments to this?
I guess my only comment would be, obviously it's a pretty unique situation where you're gonna have a substantial identified wetland area immediately adjacent to a shoreline. I mean, it's not obviously unprecedented, but it's a pretty unique situation. I guess my only comment would be, I would agree with Phil that there's discretion here. But this struck me as we kind of went through the process as one of those provisions where you probably want to be consistent with your neighbors. It's obviously a significant area of interest at DNR wetland regulation. And I know there's a lot of debate as far as how far some of that should go. But I think in this situation, I don't want to say there's a liability issue because again, I think it's a discretionary choice. This is more, I think, just one of those practical issues where, just to be safe, it may make sense to have at least some regulatory structure in place so that when you have a unique situation, let's say you have a very sensitive wetland area immediately adjacent or within a shoreline zone, that the county at least retains some ability to regulate. Because in my experience, probably one of the more, and I don't think this is a surprise, one of the more sensitive kind of policy decisions at DNR is the decision to permit, for example, the filling of a wetland area. Some wetlands are more valuable than others. And so you have discretion here. It's not requiring that you take necessarily a certain path, but it's at least giving you the option so that if there is that scenario, and again, I guess Phil can probably comment to this. I don't know how many lakes in Washington County would even fit within, this designation with the sensitive wetland area. But I think from the staff's perspective, from Jamie, from Brad's, I think it makes sense to have this in place. But again, it is a policy determination that the committee can consider.
So, anybody want to make any comments on that section at this point?
So we're talking about section L, the yellow highlighted section, correct?
Yes.
When I read it, it says all structures. But what I just heard from Mr. Curtis was there is discretion. But when I read all, I don't see the discretion. Or the discretion of the policy, of us to set the policy or not. Okay, I was looking if there's actually discretion of how it's enforced or.
The wordage, you're on the all structures,
Mhm.
correct?
Yep. Because
That's discretion there, right?
Well, that would get to how we're defining structure. So to Phil's point earlier, under NR 115, we are limited in that structure is a very defined term. So there can be some structures that clearly would fit within this. We have to fit within the 25-foot setback. But we'll get to an example here in a little bit where there's going to be other improvements that don't fit within the definition of structure. Not to jump the gun, but for example, stairs leading down to the waterfront, that's not going to fit within the definition of structure on NR 115, and therefore there's pretty wide discretion as far as how the county would actually want to deal with this specific situation. So really the question becomes, to your point, if something fits within the definition of structure, then this is when this provision is triggered. And then, all structures shall have a minimum setback of 25 feet. So that's kind of where your discretion does end. So if it fits within the definition of structure, then you're going to have that minimum setback of 25 feet from the wetland. So obviously there's a line at which kind of your discretion ends. And that's kind of where this analysis of the NR 115 comes in as far as what actually is defined as a structure.
Okay. Phil, one example I'm thinking of, and I don't know if it's exactly due to this code, but I think it was our last Board of Adjustment meeting, there was a driveway that was coming close to a wetland. And we allowed it because that's where the access point was. We had, in that case, we had to have the property owner pay the fee and go through the whole variance to get a driveway. So I'm trying to figure out if there's a way to avoid BOA meetings for some structures, but not all structures, or to give the staff some of that flexibility.
We talked about specific language here that essentially adds more of a gray area. That case is a result of this language, and if something comes in that wants to be closer, then, and it says no in the ordinance, the approach is it goes through the Board of Adjustment to consider that decision. So we talked about, do you just want to give the same discretionary type language that the Board of Adjustment approved or would potentially approve to the staff? I think we ultimately concluded that we could go that way. From an administration, there's nothing wrong with that, and we're certainly welcome to have that discussion. However, Phil mentioned that has only happened a handful of times. And that is sort of the purpose of the Board of Adjustment related to wanting to consider those special scenarios around wetlands. And the one you're referencing wasn't as sensitive or as big of a deal, but in theory, it could be a bigger issue. And so right now the process is through Board of Adjustment. So that is the question, and that is certainly something we can take a look at if the committee desires.
And I'm fine with it going to Board of Adjustment, except for I just knowing the price tag that it puts on, or the cost burden it puts on the property owner for something like that. I felt bad for them, I guess, and I don't know. Okay, I was trying to make sure that this is a policy that was affected that last BOA meeting that we were talking about.
Can you say that again, Brian?
This is the policy that driveway has to be away.
Yeah, that particular BOA, this is what was in effect
Okay,
that brought that particular request to the Board of Adjustments.
okay. That's all I have right now.
Well, I guess the follow-up to that is, if this is an ordinance, if I'm not mistaken, the state dictates if you're looking for a variance request to an area or use, right? And you have to meet the 3 criteria, which are pretty dang hard to meet. Unique property limitations, et cetera, no public harm. So in effect, you can't, you're never going to get those variances, because I sit on a board in the village and we don't give them out. You can't. It's a hard threshold to meet, and should be. So I guess my question is, if this isn't law, then why would we restrict property owners? Maybe that's what Krebs is getting to, is why would we create a further restriction if the experts have said you can build within the 25 feet? So are we unduly restricting our own residents and landowners' ability that the state says you can do? That would be my question.
And so this is one that I wanted to talk about, because it generates that question of what is appropriate regulation? If we just deregulated this ordinance, this would come out. However, we do have scenarios where a developer comes in to build a subdivision, or we may have a scenario on the backside of a wetland. And right away, what do you have to say or tell that person? We would like you to be a little bit further away from that environmental area, right? And so if it truly is, we don't have a problem with houses or structures or developments going in, right there. I think Phil will talk to you about they're seeing a buffer or the ability to do that as an important quality. And that's why it's in there. But it certainly is one of those places where that question comes into play.
Right. Well, and the other thing that's weighing on my mind, we all know there's a municipality in Washington County that lost a lawsuit by a landowner that the municipality thought that it had jurisdiction and it didn't, and the DNR did, with the reclamation of a land pit. So are we setting ourselves up for future potential lawsuits, that why would we do that for ourselves if we don't
Right.
have the authority or control?
Oh, do you have any thought on that? I mean, is that there's a look for lawsuits? Okay, I don't envision.
Yeah, well, I mean, that's what we have to think about for policy, because we create a policy and we have downstream impact. So are we prepared for consequences or unintended consequences? I mean, that's what policy making is about.
And this has been in place for a significant amount of time, which is why other people are going and build. So that's why the recommendation is.
So we were talking through that, Jake and I, trying to envision a scenario in which that risk is elevated by application of this, and nothing off the top of our head comes to mind that says there's any sort of significant risk of lawsuit by enforcing this. We had talked also a moment ago, and I understand Supervisor Krebs is giving an example about something that goes to BOA. The driveway example that's not a structure that would still have had to have gone to BOA. But we can talk about that more internally and try to assess whether or not this presents any significant risk to the county liability. As we sit here now, it doesn't really ring that would be a problem, but we'll talk about it internally if that remains a concern.
I guess the one thing I would add too is there's nothing prohibiting us, because I guess one of the elephants in the room is the fact that, DNR will in all likelihood have comments once we have kind of a final draft for consideration. But there's nothing prohibiting us from, at that point, if the committee wishes us to have a conversation with DNR to kind of walk through, for example, in the event the committee would decide to remove that provision. That's the type of situation where Phil and I and Brad and Jamie can have that conversation with DNR to kind of see what the reaction would be. There's nothing prohibiting us from doing that, because ultimately this is the committee's decision.
Okay, shall we move on? All right, next item. Let's see here. Yeah, page 28. We have some highlights in blue on that page. On this page, well, really, we just wanted to give you a little bit of a background on mitigation. Where it's proposed to be in the ordinance and where it used to be. We do have situations that are going to require mitigation for certain projects. And we do have the section in here that offers mitigation procedures and options for property owners to choose from to deal with that requirement. We had a mitigation section developed back in 2001 when we adopted water body classification, which had 3 different classes of water bodies. And we had a mitigation section which assigned points for various mitigation practices, and for each different class of water body, you had to get a certain number of points to satisfy the mitigation requirements. Well, we had to eliminate water body classification, and therefore we had to kind of pull back on our mitigation section to accommodate the new situation that went into play with the ordinance amendment from approximately 4 years ago, which Jamie mentioned to start this section off. Anyway, we just wanted to tell you that we do have a mitigation section in there that applies to the current ordinance and to the proposed ordinance. And we feel that the point system we have in there is a good system that staff can use to assign points and determine what is a proportional mitigation measure to deal with a proposed project. So we just kind of wanted to highlight that and let the committee know some background on that and where that's going to be in the new ordinance. So if there's any questions regarding mitigation, I could answer them now. Otherwise, we'll move on. Okay, going on here, let's see.
Page 28, number E or letter E. It looks like the section in red, is that new? Is that being inserted?
That is something that we have been required to put in the ordinance by DNR. That is something that the state legislature passed a few years ago and is now required to be in each county ordinance across the state.
Yes, it's new.
And that's all DNR verbiage there.
Yes,
Would it be better to just cite section 59.692 and sub, what it says there and just leave it at that?
you want to comment on that one, Brad or Jake?
Sorry,
we hear the question? He's referring to on page 28, the red highlighted section E.
I'll make a note of that. We'll check on that. DNR specifically provided that to us, so that's fine with us. Would be fine with us if permitted. So we'll go back and take a look at that.
I'm just thinking that if they change one word later on, if we have to come back and make those minor adjustments, the more we just reference their code, the better.
And from a drafting standpoint, so I'm catching up here. From a drafting standpoint, we did attempt to do that, but you're absolutely right.
Sorry, Jake. Can you use the mic, the live stream only picks up the mic?
Okay, sorry. That's a very good comment from a drafting standpoint, when in fact one of the earlier drafts had a significant addition, which essentially was going to pop in a section of chapter 59 into your ordinance. And after discussing it with among the group, we decided that simply a reference to chapter 59 was better, because you're absolutely right. Down the road, if there's a significant revision to chapter 59, as opposed to the committee having to go back and amend its ordinance, it's simply a reference to the relevant statute. So we can definitely look at that, and if there's a way we can even simplify it further, we can do that.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, anything else in that?
What is the enforcement? Just curious. So if we make these changes and somebody pops up and does something that's retaining all the things that we don't people do things without approval at time. What is the enforcement by the county?
What is the typical enforcement procedure? If we find a violation of the ordinance, typically it starts by issuing a letter requiring the removal or generally the removal of the structure. And if after 30 days compliance is not achieved, we generally send a second letter. And then after that, if no compliance is achieved, we can issue a citation or citations to try and achieve compliance.
Got it. But if just curious, that section that put in E that Mr. Krebs is talking about, if it's undetected and if it's over 10 years, then there's no enforcement of it. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay.
That's where I read it.
Thank you.
Okay. Go on to the next point. Looks like page 32. In the middle of the page there, you'll see a highlighted section regarding lot sizes, width, setbacks, and tree cutting. This particular section deals with planned unit developments and condominiums in general. And we just made one change there. You'll see where it's underlined in that paragraph. It says of adequate size and distance, so it's to not cause pollution or erosion. We took out the word in there that said shall not be so small as to cause pollution or erosion, and substituted these words to try and be a little bit more clear on what should be done to address it. So it's really a minor change, but we thought it was important to make. And moving on to page 33. In the middle there, you'll see D, backlot development. That is something we've had in the ordinance for the last 19 years also. And actually, Jake might want to comment on this a little bit more, but we did have some restrictions on backlot development, as you know, development on lots off of the lake, and then but people having access to the lake for using a boat or whatever. Jake pointed out that maybe there was something else we could use, and I guess I'll let Jake finish the comment on that part.
Yeah, as we discussed earlier, and part of the review process included looking at other counties and you know, again, not no requirement to exactly match your neighbors, but obviously it's a good reference point in addition to the model ordinance. What I highlighted was in certain counties, I believe it was Waukesha, has what they call a pyramiding scheme, so that as Phil kind of alluded to, you can have situations where there's maybe a development adjacent to a lake, and you know, a developer as part of the development has, you know, an easement access to the lake. The question becomes, you know, you can envision scenarios where, you know, depending on the size of the lake, you may want to at least somewhat manage the number of developments that again, they're not on the shoreline, but by way of an easement have access to the lake. I'm not suggesting it's been a problem here in Washington County, but there have been other counties where you see these enormous developments that by way of maybe one easement have access to dozens and dozens of property owners. And obviously that's very much one of those situations where it's a policy choice. But you have to weigh obviously the interests of those property owners that have invested and have actual lakefront property. Because it's not hard to envision situations where a lake can get, you know, really significantly overused by essentially off shoreland property owners. So again, I'm not suggesting one or the other is better. You can essentially really have no arrangement. You can have a very specific pyramiding scheme, similar to what Waukesha has. I forget what the actual ratio is, but essentially it's a ratio. For every easement, you can have X number of off shoreland property owners. And whether it's 5 to 1, 10 to 1, 20 to 1, that's a policy decision. I think what we've outlined is an option for the committee to consider, so that as opposed to having really, you know, uncertainty as to what that arrangement would look like, you could have a ratio. I think that, and let Phil, unless you have anything to add. So again, I'm not suggesting that you have to do this. I don't think there's really any sort of legal requirement. It's just simply a policy decision as far as how the county wants to manage lake access for those individuals that don't actually own shoreline property.
Right?
Question probably for legal. Do easements have riparian rights as a property owner?
Yeah, they can.
They can or they do?
They typically do.
So I'm trying to figure out, would we be infringing on those riparian rights by restricting their development of parcels?
Well, you're not, I don't know if I'd look at it like you're restricting the development. I mean, what you're doing is you're making a policy determination so that, again, I mean, I'm a visual person, right? You have a lake, you have the property owners around the lake, and then let's say you have an easement that provides access to the lake from offshore land property owners. I mean, you could have every single parcel around the lake with one access point, right? It's just a decision on the part of the committee from a policy standpoint. I mean, how many property owners that don't actually have own shoreline property should essentially have, you know, non-public access, right? So what we're talking about, aside from a public access point, essentially their own easement access to the lake. That's a decision for the committee as far as how many property owners should have that access.
Is it more of a density?
Yeah,
Issue.
maybe that's a good way to think of it, right? Because it's a ratio, right? So it could be 5 to 1, right? So for every easement, you're gonna allow 5 offshore property owners. It could be 10 to 1, 21, 51, whatever you would determine.
Because in Washington County, we've left, that sounds to me more like a residential, whether it's residential or I guess commercial, it's a zoning issue, which is typically done by the municipality.
Well,
You know, if it's a R1 versus R2, whatever the zoning districts that they enforce.
So if you'll note the comment in the commented version about how, first of all, this section, we've determined that this section only applies when you're not on municipal sewer and water. Brad, this is the section we were talking about, correct? And then I just want to point out, Brian, so right now, it's not allowed. Backlot development is not permitted. And then what ends up actually happening in real time, like that's what's in there, that's what's staying in there, is no backlot is development is defined shall be permitted. So when we initially talked about this again, in as it relates to deregulating, other places have different language, which in theory allow it under certain scenarios or certain ratios like that Jake was describing, right? So it would be the thing to do to look at it that way. However, as we further vetted this is one that we don't have a case on our hands, so it's a good time to talk about it. But where residents on lakes would be extremely interested in what you would do if you make a policy deviation towards allowing this type of development. So this is an area, again, we're recommending the status quo right now. The avenue would be a planned unit development or condominium through another mechanism if a property owner came up. But it's one we wanted to highlight in your discussions or as you're talking through that about how people feel about this. This in theory could be a larger, people who live on the lakes will likely not like permitting, depending on what the regulation is that is formed. So we did put some potential language in the comments of your format that we talked about, and we ended up opting not to include that in the recommendation at this time.
Okay.
I have a question. I'm sorry, are you finished?
One more.
ahead,
You
please.
said this was only for non-sewered properties.
Grant, do you want to comment on that?
Right. Don't know. That was the thing that I looked up, right? I don't think so. I guess I'm saying.
Because I've seen some lake districts, Hartford, they do have sewer. Others, the Cedar Lakes don't. So, you know, it really could affect some, but not all.
We're just going over a scenario that we just looked at. Phil and I have spent some time on during a couple months ago or so, and I want to say we're looking at, yeah, and we were looking at what, but I think the scenario we were looking at it was not a backlot development situation, right?
I don't need an answer right now. I'm thinking that we're gonna need a lot more thought on some of this stuff. Or that would be my recommendation towards the end of this, that this committee at least gets more time to think about what we've discussed today. So I don't need an answer now on that.
And I guess I just want to emphasize one point. I think Jamie made a good point. You know, read exactly how it's currently framed, and then I guess, you know, compare to, I guess, what is an option, because right now, as Jamie pointed out, The current ordinance prohibits backlot development, except as may be specifically allowed under the terms of conditional use permit. And that references the definition of backlot development, which is on page 5 to 6. So, Supervisor, I think that's a good place to start as far as currently how you have it drafted, because if you look at the definition, it does address the issue of riparian rights. And so all we did in this process was look at some other examples to see how you could actually better define that. So to Jamie's point, I mean, right now, I would argue it's relatively restrictive in that the only way this can be considered is if you pursue a conditional use permit. What we have put forward as an option is actually essentially a defined term that would provide a ratio so that it's not always requiring a conditional use permit, because you could, again, let's just say it's a 10-to-1 ratio. At that point, from a staff standpoint, the question is simply, is this development that would have access by 1 easement point, 10 developments or less? If it is, and there's no other issues, it's consistent with with the ordinance, as opposed to having to seek a conditional use permit. So I think the attempt here, and again, ultimately it's your decision, but the attempt here was to provide an example of what a better defined, whatever we want to call it, pyramiding scheme, backlot development, what a better defined term would actually mean from a regulatory standpoint.
I guess I have a question. There's a vagueness here. It says, except as may be specifically allowed under the terms of a conditional use permit. What guidance are we giving to the governmental body that's going to issue that conditional use permit? Who is to set this 10 unit 10 limitation, or 6 or 5, whatever it is? There's no guidance you're given to the agency that's going to set the parameters for the conditional use permit.
And that agency is us. That kicks you to a planned unit development condo CUP section. And so that is the discussion, is if you don't have any guidance or policy discussion now, you put yourself in a scenario where you have an actual development. They have a proposal in front of you. You're at a public hearing stage, and there isn't truly a standard. However, I will just reemphasize, and Brian, this is an option too, as we go forward, of we can always make changes or move forward with changes, and then circle back and say, this specific topic we want to talk through more, because this one is one that probably really needs to be vetted by, how you feel as elected officials, the county executive, the lake residents. It's a fairly substantial change to begin permitting development on the lakes. So, or to be redefining how that looks. So that's one, that's why it's not in here right now, because, we wanted to make sure that it was vetted and that time was given to make, if any direction is going to be going that way.
Thank you.
Okay, should we move on? All right, let's see what the next thing is. All right, page 38. You'll see to the right on the page under the notes part, there's a highlighted section in yellow. This essentially is what we refer to as a vegetative screening requirement. We are proposing to remove this section from the ordinance. This is a choice of the county. And this particular requirement has been in there again since 2001. And essentially what it is that when a new house or structure is proposed on a lake or river, and there is not enough vegetation screening that structure as you look at it from the lake or river, this section makes a requirement for a certain amount of plantings to be placed between the lake or river and the structure. Well, over the years, over the 19 years we've been administering this, the staff has found this section extremely hard to administer and enforce. for a number of reasons, mostly that it depends on your view from the lake or river. It depends on the type of tree, shrub, species you use, projected growth at maturity, and so on and so on. So due to that being hard to administer and enforce, and due to it not being a requirement, we are proposing to remove it entirely from the ordinance. So we don't really have a sense of the entire public's view on this, but we have had a lot of pushback on requirements for this over the years. And it's just a staff feeling, I guess you would say, is that it should be eliminated because it cannot be clearly administered. Any thoughts on that?
At the end of the paragraph, it does reference state statutes for the vegetative buffer plans. Is by deleting the paragraph, would we be the state require? Are there state requirements or not?
There is another section of the ordinance that is required by the state regarding the removal of shore cover. It gets at this a little bit, but it doesn't go to the extent that this particular section does.
Okay,
That will still be in the ordinance.
so it would become less restrictive, but there still is a minimum as far as vegetation
Yes,
from the state.
yes, there is.
And I guess just from a technical standpoint, that section, I know can be. If I'm understanding your point correctly, the section 275(8), that's section 275 8 of your ordinance. Because again, you're asking good kind of legal questions that those aren't state statutes in there. So because you're right, we would always be cautious to remove something that actually references a requirement under state law. Above that, there's a reference to NR 115, but that's not being deleted. So I think good question, but I think we're safe there.
I've seen and heard many discussions and debates about this screening over the years with working on lake properties and stuff. And I would agree with staff that this is a very subjective and hard to enforce, frustrating ordinance. And I would agree with the removal of it.
If I can just take one quick step back, Phil, I don't know if you were going to address this, but I just wanted to point out kind of an example of why I think this was a really good process. And I think, we kind of made a good team on this. Above that, I think it's highlighted. We're suggesting that we include a process to address pervious surfaces. I don't know if anybody in the committee is involved in the construction industry, but there's some actually really interesting technology out there where you can essentially have what would have normally historically been an impervious surface. In other words, which is a big deal, right? Because you put it in a driveway, that's going to create runoff. There's actually some very interesting technology out there that essentially, I think it's normally asphalt, but you can have an asphalt surface that can actually allow water to safely reach ground level, which for purposes of kind of from a regulatory standpoint, you can have some interesting arrangements where what would normally have been something that would have been regulated because of runoff possibly be allowed, which I think gives some really interesting options to property owners. And then from a staff standpoint, the way we framed it is assuming that proposal is certified by somebody that is familiar with that new product and that technology, because it is kind of, frankly, cutting edge. That staff then has the ability to take into consideration, frankly, a unique option for a property owner. So I just wanted to point that out, that this is frankly something that many counties don't have, and I think is a really good addition to give some flexibility to staff to accommodate property owners that want to do something frankly, again, kind of cutting edge as far as shoreline areas go.
Okay, I'll move on to page 41. Just this kind of minor, but I want to point it out. You'll see on the right there, it says it's highlighted, a sand beach with 100 square feet maximum area. This particular section that this is in is the shoreline wetland section. And this, again, was something put in the ordinance a number of years ago. And actually, after reviewing this, you cannot really have a sand beach within a shoreline wetland district. This should have never been in there in the first place. And it is relatively small amount of area, but this should not be something that's allowed in the shoreline wetland portion of the shoreline district. So we're just going to take that out. And see what's next here. We got here. Oh, on page 42, on the right-hand column, you'll see the whole thing highlighted. That is a repeated mitigation section. We're proposing to just take that out. This section is really a duplication of the other mitigation section that is already in the ordinance. This is essentially something that happened due to a reorganization of this ordinance, the entire ordinance, a number of years ago. And in that reorganization, two mitigation sections were put in, which essentially say the same thing. So we're simply taking one out. It was a duplication. 60. All right, now we're moving way on to page 68. 60. Oh, okay, here, this is about certificates of compliance. And Brad, you want to talk about this one?
We had, Phil and I had looked at this and we had tried to figure out what actually needed to be in this particular section or not in terms of certificates of compliance, trying to define what these things were and whether they needed to be in there. And it turned out we were able to vastly streamline this particular section while remaining in compliance with the law. And they just, I think the way this was originally looked at when it was drafted is that we just had way more requirements and things there than were really appropriate or necessary, and it was way wordier than it needed to be. And so the idea was just to streamline it and make it more into what really needed to be enforced and how. That's really the bottom line on it.
What do we got next? Okay. Yeah, I think that's it.
Okay, so does anybody have any other questions on anything that they saw when they were going through it that we did not cover? We have Jake, Brad, Phil, everybody's here today if you have any specific questions.
You'd mentioned other stakeholders. So have we had listening sessions with any of the lake associations in the county to get any feedback or input at this point? Or is that intended with the public hearing?
So we have not at this point, as we talked about that. We did send out to all of the lake districts notice of essentially this agenda with the attachments and of this meeting, and that it would be available online, wanting to draw their attention to it early if they had comments. As we walked through this and we went through each individual change, we ended up feeling as though most of them were relatively straightforward or being required of us. We didn't think there would be a lot of public input on certificate of compliance. And at this point, we opted not to include a couple of the more hot button items, which we talked about, a couple of them, wetland setbacks and backlot development changes. So I think that that's part of your next discussion related to how you want to move forward or how we want to move forward is really just that is, are we comfortable with the changes that we have at this point? And what do we want to see that process look like? So I don't know.
I believe you have a suggested schedule for this, or we discussed this yesterday, I believe.
Yep.
As to what are the next steps, what are the timeframes, and where do we need to go from here before this ultimately comes up to the board itself?
Yeah, I think what we talked about was we need 4 weeks roughly to schedule a public hearing. And so what we had potentially talked about is September is the meeting where this group usually takes up the budget. And there's a couple other things happening in September. So what we talked about is giving this committee the chance to just digest this, county board members, people who are interested, go back, talk to potential stakeholders, formulate where your issues might be and how you feel about this. And then we can touch base again. We'll look at some of the questions we have. I think there were 3 or 4. We'll put this back on the agenda in September just as a update where are we at, and we'll be looking to potentially move the October committee meeting of this group to the evening. Is that what we talked about?
Yes,
For that public hearing.
that way we can engage the public.
So that's sort of that's very tentative. It's all planned. It's certainly something that's open for dialogue.
Any other comments or suggestions from other supervisors in the audience? Well, I guess at this point in time, as Ms. Ludovic has said, we're going to digest this and look at, come back to this group with your questions and thoughts and ideas, and then we'll work toward some kind of a public hearing situation later in the month of September. Is that correct, Jamie?
October. Yes.
October, I'm sorry.
Does that sound like enough time? Okay. Good. All right, thank you.
All right, thank you, gentlemen, for your presentation this morning. Let's move on to the UW Extension Overview Agriculture Educator Program. Is Stephanie here? Or is someone from Extension going to make that presentation? All right. In the meantime, my apologies to Supervisor Schulteis. I did not recognize you as a new member of this committee. Welcome, Jody. Thank you. You're very welcome.
Okay, can you guys hear me? Is everybody? Yes? Okay. I can't hear unless someone talks into the mic. So I can go ahead and share my screen here. I can't share my screen. Is there a way that I can get that enabled? Otherwise, I can just go ahead and talk through without presenting the actual screen.
I think you will have to do that. I don't think we can share your screen from your end. I think it would have had to be on this side.
Okay, that's fine.
Sorry about that.
That's okay. So I was going to talk a little bit about today the economic impact of agriculture in Washington County. We did have official release of that brochure, and I had shared that with Supervisor Mary. And it focuses on the Census of Agriculture that is technically from 2017, but it was released in 2019. There were some issues getting it released. So what the economic impact of agriculture in Washington County tells us is that our farms, I can focus on right now the commodity sales. Number 1 is milk. So $62.9 million in milk sales in Washington County. Number 2 is nursery and greenhouse sales. Washington County is actually number 1 in nursery and greenhouse sales in the state of Wisconsin at 31.2 million. Number 3 commodity sales is grain at 29.2 million. 4 is cattle and calves at 23.8 million. And that includes beef production and also dairy cattle that are sold as part of the dairy process. And then number 5 is hay and other crops at 3.5 million. So agriculture in Washington County employs 4,529 or creates 4,529 jobs in the county, and that's around 7% of the county's job force. So overall, the total economic impact of agriculture in Washington County is $1.4 billion. So that is including direct effect of agriculture, the purchase of agricultural and food processing inputs, services, and equipment, and then business to business activity. The majority of that is the direct effect of agriculture. So $1.4 billion. Agriculture also pays $32.2 million in taxes. That's sales tax, property tax, and income tax. That does not include taxes that are paid in support of local schools. If it did, that number would be much higher. So who owns the farms in Washington County? 97.5% of the farms are family farms. So that includes individual and family owned farms, family owned corporations, and family owned business structures. We sell $2.2 million of food directly to consumers. So $2.2 million in off-farm sales. And we have 578 farms that manage 126,146 acres, which is about 45.7% of the county's total acres. So I briefly went through, I can't see anyone here, but if anyone has questions on the economic impact of ag, I'm trying to briefly go through. Otherwise, I can talk a little bit about what coronavirus did to the agriculture industry. Because as we know, that's been a big change in agriculture's life. It's been a little bit of a challenging year. I cannot hear the question.
I think we're good now.
Okay.
Supervisor Gallitz,
Yep.
you'd mentioned your stats in the commodity with nursery #1 in Wisconsin.
Yes.
Curious, is that exported to multiple counties and outside of Wisconsin?
I don't have the export numbers. These are just commodity sales numbers.
Okay.
So that's just from Wisconsin. It's greenhouse horticulture and sod, and we do have very large horticultural industry here in Washington County. But that's just commodity sales numbers. That's not anything else involved in that.
Thank you.
Yep.
Supervisor Mary here, Ms. Plaster, question for you, and perhaps this goes into your discussion on COVID.
Yep.
Earlier this year, there was a great deal of publicity regarding the dairy situation, farmers dumping milk because they had no place for it to go. Have we seen a positive rebound on that situation regarding dairy?
Yes, with a caveat, and I can go into, that's a perfect segue into talking about what exactly happened with COVID. So 2019, if you were on the committee back when I came and I talked, 2019 was actually a recovery year, which was great because the 5 years prior to that were not great for agriculture. It was just down year, down in prices, not so good. 2019 was a bit of a recovery, which was great. 2020 was supposed to be even better. So at the beginning of this year, we were at good prices. We were between $17 and $18 per hundredweight, per 100 pounds of milk sold. As coronavirus progressed, that dropped rapidly to $10 per hundredweight. So what also happened was the majority of where our milk goes is into the restaurant industry. So we have a lot of cheese that gets sold. We have a lot of fluid milk that goes into schools. And without those there, when the whole country shut down, we didn't have anywhere to go with the product. Now, grocery store sales have been great. That's been one of the things that has kind of helped the dairy industry along. But as everyone heard, as the markets were getting really confused, we had a lot of supply chain issues with the restaurants and the schools shutting down. So that caused a couple of bumps in the road where farms were asked to dump milk. A lot of farms were asked to reduce production. We've had a lot of production and cow number decrease. That's actually been coming back up. So we're in a slight recovery. After we got down to the bottom of that $10 per hundredweight, we actually have seen rapid increase in prices. So prices have jumped back up. Some of us have been at 19 or over $20 per hundred. However, that doesn't tell the whole story. So what also happened was we've had just a lot of really, I don't want to say crazy, but a lot of different things happening with the market. We've had some price spreads that have been a little differently. So even though the milk price was at 19 or 20 plus dollars per hundredweight, we've had what's called a producer price differential. So the farmers were not actually receiving that because of some of the federal orders, regulations, and the pooling and depooling of milk. Producers were actually getting anywhere from $3 to $4 taken off that milk price because of some of the federal orders and what happened at the plant level. So prices have looked good, they've rebounded, but they still haven't been great. Looking forward, we're probably going to be sitting at the $15 or $16 per hundredweight mark going into the end of 2020 into 2021. Which is not great, but it's not terrible. What's made all of the difference is the federal payments. So the government payments that have happened, if folks invested in the dairy margin coverage program, they've gotten significant payments this year. And also with the CARES Act, that between those two federal programs, that has actually helped. And so 2020 for dairy producers, if they're fully engaged in those two programs, actually looks to be a better year than 2019. So overall, if farms are engaged in the federal programs, which a lot of them are, 2020 should be okay. Now we get into the grains, and it's a little bit of a different story. Again, federal payments are very much helping. A lot of corn acres were planted this year because corn prices were better than soybeans. With what happened with the coronavirus, the corn prices kind of plummeted. Soybeans have taken a little bit of an edge on that. So we'll have to see. And this year has been really great for crops, which is good, but that may oversupply the market. So we'll have to see a little bit with what happens there. The other concerning piece that's out there is, I'm assuming folks saw what happened with the GDP. GDP has significantly plunged due to the coronavirus. When that's happened in the past, it has created a recession. If we are entering into a recession, that's where this concern starts to come in, as if this is going to be another prolonged period of low prices. Because if we enter into a recession, we're not going to get the recovery that we've been projected to have, which is extremely necessary after 5 years of sunken prices. So it's a little bit of a wait and see, as a lot of things are, but there's a little bit of hope on the, if folks are very conservative in how they're spending their money, if they're not putting in new facilities, if they're not expanding, they're following good business practices, folks can weather this. It should be okay. It should be okay if they're using all the risk management tools that they have and they're following smart business practices. We saw a significant loss in farms. We've seen that it's a little bit ahead of the trend that we've seen over the past 15 years. But right now, the farms that we have, if they're following good business practices, they should be able to make it through okay, at least through the end of 2020.
Thank you, Steffi. Supervisor Mary, back again. Two questions regarding, and just quickly, you mentioned $15 to $16 per hundredweight. What would the typical break even be for the average dairy producer in Wisconsin? And the second part of that question, what impact has COVID had on milk parlor employee situations?
So the first question, if you're a great farm, if you're very good at what you do, I've seen numbers down at $14 per hundred in order to produce it. A lot of farms are at that $17 per hundredweight mark. So that $15 to $16 per hundredweight, if we're not getting the premiums that we've seen, and there's more going on with this, a lot of what's happening right now is farms have traditionally bred their animals are producing for fat, But right now, protein is what's paying. If that trend continues, we might see them a little bit more hurt as far as the milk check goes. But farms that are well managed, have their numbers under control, at $15 to $16 per hundredweight, they still could be making a positive net income, but a lot of them are above that mark, so they could be losing money. I usually see farms around that 17. So not great. Remind me of your second part to that question.
The second part was the effect of COVID on some of the workforce involved in the farms.
Yep. So there was a lot of concern early on about, of course, the effect of COVID on the workforce. We haven't seen a huge impact on that. As far as a lot of positive caseloads, it's been more so those meat packing plants, as a lot of people heard on the farm. One of the things we're lucky about is that we're outside. We've got that fresh air going for us. But there has been a lot of increase in personal protective equipment and sanitation. So it's been a little bit just like most other industries. We've just had to increase what we're doing with personal protective equipment and sanitation. There was a shortage of personal protective equipment at the beginning of the COVID, as everyone was grabbing onto what's essential equipment for farm workers, which are masks and specifically latex gloves were getting really hard to find. Dairy workers use those in the milk house. But otherwise, the workers haven't seen the case numbers that we were fearful of, but it's been very stressful because you just didn't know what to expect.
Thank you, Stephanie. Any other questions from Ms. Plaster this morning? And then thank you for giving up your time this morning. Thank you very much.
Yep, not a problem.
With that, we'll move on to the action item regarding the Parks and Trails Fiscal Sustainability Plan.
Good morning. We prepare the Parks and Trails Sustainability Plan as a little bit of an internal sort of guide for the year as we go into the budget planning process that you will see next month. And so it is on your agenda tonight to kind of give you a flavor for the direction that we are heading. We are asking if you're willing to make a motion to endorse the plan. And with that, I'd be happy to answer any questions that you might have.
I have one question. This comes back to page 5 of your presentation, 2021 sustainability goals. Under the chart there, you've got tax levy supporting park operations with a subnote. Property tax levy will continue to fund the park enterprise portion of rent to the highway department. This shows a $50,000 of tax levy. Is that an actual 50,000 payment or is that a transfer of funds within the county?
It is a transfer of funds within the county. The highway department needs to charge the parks and grounds operations, so including, we also do snow plowing for the county grounds rent. That is required if they want to charge the state of Wisconsin rent. So the total rent charge that they give us annually is roughly $80,000. So it's a transfer from our fund from their fund. They charge us and we transfer money to them for that payment. So part of this discussion was that levy 30,000, so it would be 80,000 total, but 30,000 was already being charged out to levy related functions because that's the percentage that goes to, say, salting the highway shop or grounds related things, which are the Parks Enterprise collects money from the tax levy for grounds. So that's the remaining balance. So essentially one of the things we talked about is that that's not really a fair thing to be sustaining with park user fees, and because it's sort of a county transaction that we don't want to go down the ballpark. So we had that ballpark. So we had kind of talked internally with the county executive and agreed that that would be a logical place to be the zero balance, if you want to call it that.
Okay, thank you. And we haven't seen all the budget figures yet, but based on what you've presented here, the headline is going to be that the parks are no longer on the levy. Is that correct?
Yes,
For fiscal 2021.
correct.
Okay, thank you. Any other questions or comments? Yes, Supervisor Gallants.
Chair. I, I fully support the sustainability plan, parks, trails, et cetera, but I look at all the improvements that are going on there. At some point in time, there's going to be diminishing returns. And I'm curious if we've looked into that, because if we saturate the market with X number of rentals, I mean, not only from the county, but, local private businesses, at some point in time, it's saturated. And I'm wondering if we've looked at that down the line, because if we put a lot of money into infrastructure repair and upgrades, at some point in time, there's going to be diminishing returns, and do we recoup those investment over a period of time? And then also, the previous comment about potential recession, do we need to be mindful of throwing monies out when that return could be pushed out even further if we do go into a recession? Because consumers have limited pool, always have limited pool of entertainment dollars, if you will. So whether it be doing a verbal with us or somewhere else, or a party or whatever, those are limited dollars typically. So I'm just curious, how do we factor the diminishing return on that investment for property, or I'm sorry, for the park sustainability?
So the short answer to your question is no. However, we have been talking both with the county executive and economic development in Washington County and internally about how this year we will hit our goal. Park maintenance and operations will no longer be funded with the property tax levy, and the shift in focus will be towards the maintenance of the existing amenities, the enhancements, and the long-term viability. You see that in this plan on page 5 to develop the EDWC Horizon business plans. For specifically, we'll be looking at pricing and market analysis and demand driven things and long-term planning for the Glacier Hills Cabin Campground and the barn at Homestead Hollow. Those are the two we picked to do this year. I do recognize your point that there's much more. There's user fees, there's the standing room cabins, there's all the rest of the stuff. But I think what this is will continue to be a work in progress towards a vision that I think you described well, which would be that we get to that place where we feel good about, where that's going, and we're adjusting on the fly to what the potential pitfalls might be and making decisions accordingly.
Right, and that was noted in here due to, I guess, COVID and presumably some revenue shortfalls that were putting projects on hold. Just wondering if we need to revisit that to be more cautious. That was my question.
Oh, for 2021 or moving forward, or for 2020, 2021 or moving forward?
A number of items listed that are on hold, but again, not knowing what's going to happen in 2021. And all indicators are that we'll still all be working from home for months to come. Will that continue to curtail public use of these properties or others? And do we need to revisit how much we're going to lay out in expenses for updates in 2021? That's guess what I'm trying to get at. Or do we need to be more conservative in expenditures in 2021?
It's a good point. We believe that we're relatively conservative, and we are focusing only the outlay expenditures on those things that we believe enhance the revenue streams we do have. So the park user fees, or we're relying on to generate the revenues that we're budgeting. So we're backing those down. We have some very strong revenue streams in 2020, and we have adjusted, and you will see some relatively aggressive revenue projections in 2021. So I understand your point about the unknown of if we can deliver that and if we should back down expenditures. I guess the answer to that is we're doing the best we can. We have some vacancies right now. We have some, we're going to talk about another item, which we have a healthy fund balance. The cash balance is there for these types of things. So I think absent the data and that tracking, there's always the unknown. But I guess the answer is we're doing the best we can.
Let me put the cart back behind the horse on this. Before we have any future or continued discussion on this, we do need a motion to endorse the sustainability plan as presented, the motion in a second. Then we should be able to continue the discussion. Is there a motion? Supervisor Gallup?
Accept for consideration? What's the actual?
You're just motion to endorse. This won't
Okay.
go to the county board.
Endorse, yes.
Is there a second? Supervisor Schulteis, thank you. Now, continue the discussion, Jamie. Any other discussion points you want to bring up?
No.
Yes, Supervisor Krebs.
Could you expand on, I can't find it in the list here, but I know I read it earlier. You're working with EDWC on a plan or a program?
We are. So
what was
in
that?
this past year, actually last winter, so we do see a relatively strong workload increase during the spring, summer, and fall seasons, to a certain degree. So this past year, we started down this initiative at the after discussion with the county executive related to, and we started with the Washington County Golf Course. So we have some experience doing this. We have the dashboard set up and the financial mechanisms for measuring performance out there and where we're hoping to go, and what we're trying to achieve. That program that we now have purchased includes essentially consulting from EDWC. So we've been working with Dan Anhalt to put together these plans. We have the meetings set up for parks kind of as we go into the fall season. And it starts with a full assessment, market assessment of what's going on in the marketplace. What are the competing forces, some pricing analysis type work. We talk about mission, vision, values, sort of the direction that's headed in each of those operations. For the golf course, it was a little easier because we have had a significant amount of policy discussions over the years about what their purpose is and what they're trying to achieve. We have talked about, I know Supervisor Mary and I and the county executives team, we have talked about how as we get into talking through some of those higher level policies that drive the decisions around some of these smaller enterprises, that we may be talking about what is the role for the governing body as it relates to what those are as we put together measurables and performance metrics to sort of measure the achievements in each area that we're working towards. So to use the golf course as an example, there are 4 customer delight, productivity, financial, fiscal, like financial indicators, and innovation. And so we've set up metrics in all of those related to executing strategic price increases, delivering on specific targeted. So one of them is essentially revenues, and we're now measuring certain things. Innovation, we talk about initiatives like the golf simulator and some of the things we're doing with the carts and what we're looking at doing with some of the golf maintenance. In the customer delight, we implemented a new survey on our carts with 5-star ratings. So we have benchmarks for customer service, and some of the things we're trying to do with customer service. And then we have, I'm missing a category. Oh, community. is one of the categories, because the other prong of the golf course's mission is what are we doing to build community? And so we have some metrics and initiatives that we work towards. Now we had COVID this year, so a lot of those were impacted. So we have some red, yellow indicators on some of the hosting outings or doing things with Special Olympics, because we just aren't able to necessarily engage in the community the way that the vision is set forth for that. So as those develop, I think they're really good at holding people accountable, talking through what the goals are, and at a broader picture of what happens in the next 1, 3, and 5 years for what is the vision for the campground collectively at Glacier Hills, and what does that look like, and what are the little pieces that drive revenue and that need to happen to be successful. So it's a great program. Dan Anhalt has been fabulous. I speak very, very highly of that. And I think to that point is, we wish we had unlimited resources and we could dedicate more time to these types of initiatives. But so we're really just at that point where we're doing the best we can.
Okay. Just as a general perspective on this plan, my sticking point with the park sustainability plan from the beginning has been the parks fees, the entrance fees. I think we're 2 years, 3 years into these fees now. I understand they're not going to go anywhere. It's a new tax that's here to stay. Yeah, I'm not going to say that we should be repealing it or anything, but I will not be supporting the plan because I'm still not comfortable with the fees that we're charging now. But I do somewhat support the overall direction that the fees are going towards in an attempt to improve the parks. So with that, I just want everyone to know that I will not be supporting it.
Any other discussion points before I move to a vote? Hearing none, we'll entertain a vote on the endorsement of the 2021 Parks and Trails Fiscal Sustainability Plan. All in favor, say aye. Opposed? With that, we need to move down to the next item on the agenda, which is technically, which should be item number 8. We'll have to go into a closed session. This has to do with a real estate transaction. And so at this point in time, we'll ask all those people who are not a part of this discussion, should they need to leave the room. I'm sorry? Okay, do we read a motion and go into closed session? All right, Supervisor Schultes, a second. Supervisor Krebs? Motion, I'll vote on the motion to go into closed session. Aye? Opposed? All right, now we'll go into closed session. Thank you, sir.